Welcome to Congressman Lamborn on maintaining American nuclear deterrence. Please welcome Patty Jane Geller, the Heritage Foundation's Senior Policy Analyst in the Center for National Defense.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. We're thrilled to welcome Congressman Doug Lamborn. He represents Colorado's 5th District, and he is the ranking member on the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, which is a new role for him as of this year. So he works on issues of nuclear deterrence every day. So he's one of the best people we could have here this afternoon to talk all things nuclear deterrence. And actually, this event is perfect timing because I know, sir, earlier today you had the Strategic Forces Subcommittee NDAA markup for FY 2023. So glad we scheduled this for today. Love to hear your insights on that, on NDAA, and a number of issues. So to start us off, I'd like to ask you if you could just kind of outline for us what have been some of your top priorities since you started in your role as ranking member on Strategic Forces earlier this year.
Great question, Patty Jane, and it's wonderful to be here at Heritage with all of the people who are watching online and in person. 2 of my sons have interned here at Heritage, so I think the world of this organization. And Patty Jane, thank you for inviting me also. My priorities really involve around the priorities of the subcommittee, which we have 4 buckets. One is missile defense. One is the nuclear triad, the nuclear weapons and the enterprise to keep those weapons, and then we have to modernize them. They have been aging, and President Obama, under the New START Treaty, when that passed the Senate, he promised we would modernize and the money would be there. It's a little bit of a struggle each year to make sure the money and the funding is in place, but modernization is so critical, and we'll get more into that as we get into our discussion. And hypersonics. Hypersonics are so important. Russia and especially China are really carrying the day on this, and we're behind. We're lagging. We've done a little bit of testing, a little bit of discovering how we can deploy hypersonics, but we haven't really deployed anything significant. And China is deploying every day. And that is something we are behind on, and that's maybe my biggest priority. And then lastly, I want to mention military space. Our intelligence and military satellites that need to be protected from any threats, that need to operate, that need to work properly and be effective in the new generations that are coming online. So military space is my 4th and final priority in the subcommittee.
Yeah, awesome. And I know how much work you've done on hypersonics. I'm excited to ask you about that later on. And I've several programmatic budgetary questions to get to, especially after the subcommittee markup today. But I thought it would be best to start by talking about the threat, as we always do. So one of the biggest topic on all of our minds every day these days is Russia and Putin's nuclear saber rattling over Ukraine. And there's a lot of speculation over, will Russia use a nuclear weapon? If so, how do we respond? But I want to ask you something a bit different, and that's what are some of the lessons that we're learning about the way that Russia views nuclear weapons, how it employs nuclear weapons as a tool of coercion, especially compared to the U.S. And the reason I ask that is because, now it's Ukraine, a non-NATO member, but what if next time it's Poland, Estonia? What lessons should NATO be taking away from dealing with Russia?
Patty Jane, this is really a critical and timely question. And I think one thing we learned, one takeaway, is that when Vladimir Putin makes threats, you take him seriously. He talked about invading Ukraine. Many people thought, oh, he's really not going to follow through. He's just blustering. No, he did it for sure. And thousands of people have died as a result. Another takeaway is he was been subtly and not so subtly threatening to use nuclear weapons in a conventional war, a war that's not on his territory, a war with a country that has no nuclear weapons, and yet he's been threatening them. He's been threatening any countries that help them. And it's, like I said, sometimes it's been subtle, sometimes not so subtle. They'll say, you'll see things you've never seen before. Okay, what does that mean? It can only mean nuclear weapons. So with Russia, And also look at what they've been testing and promising to field. They did an anti-satellite test recently, which created clouds of debris up in space, which even threatened their own cosmonauts and our people in the International Space Station. That was kind of destructive and unnecessary, the way they went about it. And also, Vladimir Putin has threatened to create novel types of weapons, including nuclear weapons, that the world has not seen before, like a long-distance underwater torpedo that's nuclear armed, that can go, from Europe to North America. I don't know. I don't know what his intentions are. Or a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and I don't know how that would be armed, but it would be nuclear-powered, that could, he says, go around the world and come into our country from any direction. So these are novel threats that no one has ever fielded before. And once again, it shows the threat, it shows the mentality, and how we have to take it seriously. There are some in Congress who maybe don't take it as seriously, at least not until recently. We do have a good bipartisan agreement. Hey, we've got to help Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin is totally out of control, and if not, a war criminal and everything else. So it's good right now, but we have to maintain this awareness that we have some serious threats with Russia.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment. And comparing to the U.S., you never see U.S. leaders going around making several nuclear threats. For better or worse, there's such a difference here, and I think it's important we're making sure we're dealing with Russia as it is, not the way we might wish they were to be like us. So yeah, I think you nailed that one. We have to keep the support going to Ukraine and take those threats seriously. And so of course the other threat on everyone's mind is China. Where Russia is fighting Ukraine and making nuclear threats now, but China is the one projected to become a nuclear peer to the US and Russia with the capability to execute any nuclear employment strategy. So my question for you, Congressman, is so what? China has had nuclear weapons for a really long time, and everything's been fine. What does it break it down for us? What does it really matter for our national security that now China is building up to the levels of U.S. and Russia?
Well, apart from nuclear weapons, China is fielding, like Russia, all kinds of capabilities in space. Offensive capabilities to do ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or to go after our own assets, our own critical command and control, or our own ISR platforms in space. So they are working night and day on that capability. Hypersonics, we've already mentioned that. China is beyond even Russia and way beyond ourselves, unfortunately. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, up until recently, China only had a small amount of nuclear weapons, enough to say, hey, take us seriously, don't do anything and we'll all be good. Kind of a deterrence. But lately, they've been on a building spree. They've doubled their nuclear arsenal in the last 2 years, and they are showing no signs of relenting, of keeping that going in the future. And the trouble with that, Patty Jane, is that we have New START treaties that limit what we can do with Russia. It limits our entire nuclear capability and kind of acknowledges, but not really takes China into that big of an account, because most of our competition in the past has been with Russia. But now we're locked into these agreements like 1,550 nuclear platforms and things like that for strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are a different issue. But then now China is on board, really going through a building spree, and what we've done in limiting ourselves with Russia doesn't really adequately account for the Chinese threat now.
Yeah.
So we're behind in accounting for that threat. And China hasn't shown any willingness to come to the negotiating table and do limitations or talks of limitations. And they're also doing things like concealing or making mobile different nuclear capabilities, or planning to. So there's some uncertainty with actually how big their nuclear arsenal is, and that creates uncertainty.
Right.
So with China, things are uncertain, and we haven't really addressed them unless we do some kind of expansion of our nuclear capabilities somehow, and we haven't done that yet.
Right. And if we remain behind on the Chinese nuclear threat, how do you think that might impact, or what risks does that give us for, I don't know, a contingency in Taiwan? Does that make it more difficult for us to fight China? Do we have to worry more about their nuclear weapons, for instance?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You hit the nail right on the head. And I hope that the trouble with these authoritarian regimes that are not democracies like the United States or many of our partners and allies in Europe and around the world, they sometimes see things with blinders on. They don't really have the people's perspective. They have maybe a small limited echo chamber of how they view the world. And we don't know necessarily that they have a proper grip on reality. And I think a lot of us would wonder if Vladimir Putin has a grip on reality.
Right.
He expected things to go one way. You know, it'd be easy to overrun Ukraine and capture the capital and arrest Zelensky or execute him or whatever. And none of that has happened. So they make big mistakes, and that's what's so scary.
Yeah, exactly. And so you mentioned the potential need to expand our own nuclear forces to face the new Chinese threat. So perfect segue to talking about the state of U.S. nuclear forces. You know, even though the threats are growing, I think some good news worth talking about is the increasingly bipartisan support we're seeing for modernizing the nuclear triad, which you said was one of your top priorities. You know, there's been a lot of pressure on the Biden administration from the left to whether that be going down to a dyad, cutting our ICBMs, delaying some of our modernization programs. But I at least was really pleased to see in this year's budget request all of the triad modernization programs fully funded. What do you think about that? Do you think maybe we're finally past or out of the water on debates over the need for ICBMs, the basic needs for a triad?
Well, I hope we are. I don't think we're completely past it, and there are those elements within Congress that are pacifist or unilateral disarmament oriented, and so we can't ever take it for granted. And we have to continue the debate. I'm glad that you and Heritage are so engaged, and your people like Andy Braun and others who are experts on your staff. This is important to keep up this debate and really bring awareness to the American people, and me work within Congress to bring awareness to my colleagues, because you can't take it for granted. Right now, I think because of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, we have an awareness that, hey, the world is a dangerous place, and we're doing some good steps, and I applaud the Biden administration. There's things in the defense budget proposal they sent over that I don't agree with, but I think with modernization, I think that's in a good spot. And I hope to be able to build on that bipartisan approach for this year's NDAA.
Yeah, that makes sense. So sounds like we're okay for now, but knock on wood, maybe.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so you alluded to the potential need to, maybe the next debate is going to be, do we need to adjust our modernization programs, expand our nuclear posture to account for the drastic change in nuclear threat? We have 2 nuclear peers now. We only used to have 1. What do you think? Do you think that in the next few years we're going to have to start talking about maybe fielding additional or different kinds of nuclear capabilities on top of what we're modernizing right now?
The consensus up until now, and I would maybe be more aggressive, but the consensus has been to just stick to our tried and true nuclear weapons, don't introduce any new capabilities, but to modernize what's there, because with the aging process, especially with radioactive warheads, you can't really be sure that they're always going to perform as they're intended without periodic upgrades. So I think the modernization is kind of where we're stuck at right now. Now, Russia feels free to introduce new novel weapons that we've talked about, and they're also modernizing, and they're also adding weapons where they're allowed to, which is on the tactical side, and they have thousands of those. And China is not bound by any treaty, so they do whatever they want, and we see them doing that. They're adding, we're kind of stuck in a framework where we have, with good intentions, tried to sort of cement into place an arrangement with Russia where they wouldn't be proliferating and we wouldn't be, but they're looking for ways to do that on the side. In fact, under President Trump, we had to back out of the INF, International Intermediate Nuclear Forces, if I have the acronym correct, treaty, because they were cheating on that.
Right.
So we backed out of it because we were tied our hands behind our back. We were complying and they were not. So we just had to get out of that one. But New Start, Joe Biden, one of his first acts was to say, hey, let's give you 5 more years on this, without even asking for concessions. I think that was a strategic mistake not to ask for concessions. But that is the deal we have right now. In an emergency, we could back out, but right now we're keeping to treaties, expecting in good faith the other countries to do so. And let's hope they comply, but the record has been a little spotty.
Right, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And one program that we are considering pursuing to bolster our nuclear posture is the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, the Slickman. And you've been a strong advocate for continuing that program in Congress, which I and we at the Heritage have appreciated. But unfortunately, the Biden administration has decided to cancel that program in both its nuclear posture review and this year's budget request. And I know you mentioned you don't agree with everything in the budget request. So I'm wondering, can you talk about what is the sea-launched cruise missile? Why is it so important? Why are you advocating for continuing that capability?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patty Jane. And this is one of the things, and the B-83 gravity bomb, which we might talk about in a little bit, are 2 really specific disagreements that myself and my national defense conservative friends in Congress would disagree with as well, with the Biden administration. They want to zero out the dollars for the Slickman, sea-launched cruise missile -N nuclear tipped.
Funny acronym.
And the importance of it and why we should keep funding and eventually fielding these is because they give us a new capability, sort of a niche capability. If you combine that with low-yield nuclear weapons, only because Russia has gotten up to the point where they have thousands of tactical, which means battlefield, not intercontinental, but battlefield nuclear weapons. God forbid they ever use these in Ukraine or anywhere, but they have them and they do respond to deterrence. So we need to make sure that we have them also. And that makes the world a safer place. So to be able to deliver those, if you have the cruise missile from a submarine capability, that creates doubt in the minds of our potential adversaries. And that doubt is good for deterrence because it takes away an area where they can kind of run free. They have restraints. They have to consider our capability to address a situation that otherwise they can just ignore because we could come after them under certain circumstances with the Slickman. So that's why I don't want to zero that out.
Right.
I think that's taking away, taking away a tool out of our toolbox that we should have available.
Right, I agree. I think that's a great assessment. And part of that's probably China, too. China has hundreds of these regional nuclear-capable missiles, and we don't have any nukes in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the Slickman would be good there, too. I think you've made that argument before as well.
Yeah.
So no funding for Slickman in the budget, but it seems to me, at least, like there's some growing support in Congress for the Slickman. I know you've had more than a few of our senior military leaders come over and testify in favor of the program. Admiral Richard, General Milley have said we should keep it going, for instance. What's your assessment of the prospects of getting Slickman funded this year? Do you think that, from your perspective in Congress, do you think we could do it?
Patty Jane, I hope we can at least have it funded where we can continue doing the behind-the-scenes R&D on this program and evaluate in the future. Maybe the need will go away. I doubt it. It may intensify. But at least having that option, I think, is important for the future. So while I don't think we can have dollars for actually building and deploying these for the immediate time being, because we have the White House, the Senate, and the House all under Democrat control. But let's say things change in January, which I hope they do. And if this happens for national security reasons, we would have that maybe as an option to bring back out on the table again. But let's don't zero it out and see it go away.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And I hope we'll get that result with your leadership in the NDAA markup next week, I think.
Or later this month.
Later this month,
yeah.
You know. Great. So, and then let's move on to the other issue up for debate. You mentioned the B-83 gravity bomb,
Yes.
which was also zeroed out by the Biden administration. And you made a great point in, I think it was a May subcommittee hearing, that you don't see the rationale for canceling this weapon when we need it to hold at risk hard and deeply buried targets. And we've heard the administration say, oh, well, it's too old, it's a clunky weapon, it's unnecessary to maintain. But can you explain to us, so what are hard and deeply buried targets that we're worried about, and why do we need to keep the B-83 around to hold those at risk?
Patty Jane, once again, a great question. One example would be North Korea. North Korea makes a habit of digging these tunnels that they use for storing and bringing to the surface in a time of conflict a nuclear weapon, a missile with nuclear warheads on it. So if it's deeply buried, you need a certain kind of weapon, and your average, I say average nuclear weapon, is not capable of addressing that. So once again, it's a tool in the toolbox with the deeply penetrating capability or features of the B-83. You have something that our other nuclear weapons don't necessarily have. And so it's a capability that by having it, you create doubt in the mind of a potential adversary, and it takes away some of their options and keeps them more under control, basically, more hopefully in a reasonable frame of mind to not start anything horribly ill-advised or aggressive. And even with Russia and China, there could be the potential for deeply buried targets. But certainly with North Korea, we see that that's something they're working on all the time to create.
Yeah, good point. North Korea is a good example, and we're hearing all the news stories about a new nuclear test by them as well. B-83, do you anticipate that will be another debate in NDAA to get funded?
Yes, Patty Jane, it will be like the Slickman Funding. It'll be a debate, and it's something where I totally disagree with the Biden administration on. Like I said earlier, I'm giving them credit for modernization dollars, and that's good. Let's build on that common ground. But in the case of the Slickman and the B-83, I totally disagree.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You talked about our adversaries are building so many things up. Maybe not a good time to take down our own capabilities.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I'd like to turn to pit production, which I see at least as maybe another debate coming up this year. And as you know well, sir, the United States doesn't conduct live tests of its nuclear weapons. Instead, we rely on stockpile stewardship and modernization programs to ensure that our stockpile is safe, secure, and effective. And critical to that is the ability to restore our plutonium pit production capabilities, which I don't think we've had since 1983. But unfortunately, last year we heard that we won't meet our goal or requirement of being able to produce 80 plutonium pits per year, which we need for our old weapons. So can you explain to us what are some of the risks of facing delays in our plutonium pit production capability? Why does this matter so much?
Well, plutonium is a radioactive metal, and as a result, we don't know how it lasts over decades of just sitting in storage waiting to be used. If it deteriorates too much, then it's not a usable weapon, and it does not have the credibility of being an effective deterrent. So both our adversaries may want to take advantage of that, or our allies who depend on us. We have about 30 countries under our nuclear umbrella. And if they start doubting that we have a credible deterrent, they're going to want to strike out on their own. And we're going to have more proliferation in the world. And I don't think anyone really wants that. So we have to have plutonium pits. Pits are what are compressed at the strategic time of detonation and reach critical mass and explodes. And it's an art in making these, but we're the only country that can't really make them on any kind of scale right now.
Yeah.
So although we invented it, we've let that capability atrophy. So we have to have that capability, and we have to have the funding to produce that capability.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And even North Korea can produce pits, is that right?
That's
We're
my
the
understanding.
only
That's my
nuclear
understanding.
state. Yeah. So it's my understanding the National Nuclear Security Administration requested extra funding to try and speed up the plutonium pit production schedule. I think that's another issue that we might see coming up.
That's one of those funding issues. We have to make sure it's online, and it's not going to happen overnight. So we have to prepare for the future by funding it right now. Yeah,
makes perfect sense. And so we have time for, I don't know, maybe one or two more questions. And I told you I'd ask about hypersonics because you're doing so much work on that issue. You know, we've kind of a theme of our discussion has been maybe the U.S. is at risk of falling behind as our adversaries are building up their capabilities. How do we stand when it comes to hypersonics? You know, maybe our offensive and even our defensive systems against hypersonics.
Another great question, Patty Jane. We are behind the Russians and way behind the Chinese. Hypersonics are those ships, rockets, missiles, whatever you call them, that can go 5 times the speed of sound or more. And they're very hard to defend against when they're going so fast. And so they can, even carrying a conventional warhead or just hitting something without a warhead because they're going so fast, they can do tremendous damage. And so they're a capability that China has exploited because they kind of see that we don't have that, and it fits their geographical situation, position. So, but we're starting to address this. I'm really pushing for it to make sure we have the funding in place, the testing, and then the earliest possible fielding of models, and then continuing to refine and develop those models. And whether it's air-launched from a plane or ground-launched or even sea-launched eventually, these are things we have to be bringing online. And it's one of my priorities to keep our country safe because we're losing that we've gotten behind on the capability. And then to defend against these, no one can do that.
Right.
And I'm hopeful that with our creative genius, our industrial might as a country, that once the brilliant people we have working in defense industry and for the government, once we really set our minds to it, we can maybe come up with defenses. But that day is not here right now, and we have to work on that and fund that R&D as well.
Yeah, that's a big project. Do you think how is the budget this year for hypersonics? Are we kind of in a good place, at least moving forward, or is there a lot more
we're moving forward, but not as fast or as much as I would like.
Right.
So I'm going to be looking to add amendments to the budget where we're putting more dollars into this critical need.
Oh, great. We'll look forward to seeing that, I guess, the full NDAA markup in a couple weeks. Yeah. Awesome. So we're coming close to the end of our event here. I think we're right about the end of our time. But before we close, did I miss anything? Are there any other critical issues we should talk about or that you want to add for our audience as we get back to our NDAA debates?
Pat Jane, I think you've addressed so many of these issues so well, and I appreciate your interest and everyone associated with Heritage and watching their interest as well. These are critical issues for our national security, and I'm just personally glad I have the opportunity to work on national defense. It's my way of serving and giving back to my country, and it's a great thing to work on. It's maybe the most critical. And when you read our Constitution, providing for the common defense is maybe job number 1 for our government. And we lose sight of that sometimes, but I'm going to make sure that is our top priority. And it's wonderful to be working on that. And I'm so glad Heritage is strong on this issue as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks so much for your leadership on these issues and for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. And thanks so much to our audience for joining us. I think you might receive a short survey after the event if you wouldn't mind filling that out. And with that, we'll close the event and thank the Congressman again.
Thank you.